Imagine you are watching the most powerful military alliance on Earth holding a press conference to tell the world they are winning. The man at the center of it all, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, is speaking with quiet confidence. He is dismantling narratives, mocking his enemies, and declaring that the force his country unleashed 13 days ago has bent the arc of history. And then, right there in the middle of his first press conference since launching the biggest Israeli military operation in the history of the state, the wail of air raid sirens cuts through the room. Not a drill, not a symbolic gesture. Ballistic missiles launched from Iran, arcing towards central Israel in real time. That is what happened on March 12, 2026. And if you want to understand what it means, you need to understand everything that came before that siren. Go back to February 28th. It was Purim, the Jewish holiday of deliverance. And Israel chose that morning, deliberately, to launch what it called Operation Roaring Lion, a joint strike with the United States that was, by any military measure, staggering in its ambition. 200 Israeli fighter jets entered Iranian airspace and struck nearly 500 targets in the first 24 hours alone. More than 1,200 bombs were dropped in the opening day. U.S. forces, running their own parallel operation code-named Epic Fury, struck alongside the Israelis using Fa-18 Super Hornets, F-35s, Tomahawk cruise missiles, and one-way attack drones, hitting targets from Tehran to Tabriz. In the first 12 hours of the combined assault, American forces alone carried out over 900 strikes. The stated objective was to take out Iran's nuclear program, dismantle its ballistic missile infrastructure, destroy its navy, and create what Netanyahu and Trump both openly described as the conditions for regime change. And from the very first minutes of the operation, they got results that exceeded even their own public claims. The opening Israeli salvo struck a compound in Tehran, where Iran's supreme leader, the 85-year-old Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, had assembled his top advisors. Netanyahu had called Trump just days before to tell him about the meeting and where it was being held. The strike hit its mark. By the early hours of March 1st, Iranian state media confirmed what Israel had already announced. Khamenei was dead. Let that sink in. For 47 years, Khamenei had been the face of a regime that chanted death to Israel and death to America as a cornerstone of its foreign policy. He oversaw the development of Iran's nuclear ambitions, built the largest missile arsenal in the Middle East, and funded and armed a network of proxy forces across Lebanon, Gaza, Yemen, Iraq, and Syria, designed to encircle and eventually destroy the Jewish state. And in the pre-dawn darkness of February 28th, he was killed in an airstrike on his own compound. The day the news broke, Trump posted on Truth Social, calling Khamenei one of the most evil people in history. Israel's defense minister Israel Katz stood in front of cameras and called it a preemptive strike. Netanyahu addressed the Israeli people in a carefully filmed video from an undisclosed location, invoking the story of Purim, the ancient Persian plot to destroy the Jewish people that was thwarted by courage and strategy, and declared that Operation Roaring Lion had opened. He said the lion has roared and quoted the prophet Amos. He was not being theatrical. He believed it. And in that moment, so did much of the world watching. Iran was not going to take it quietly. Within hours of the first Israeli strikes, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps activated what they called Operation True Promise to 4, the fourth in a series of direct retaliatory missile campaigns going all the way back to April 2024. But this one was different in scale and scope from anything that came before it. Iran launched missiles not just at Israel, but across the entire region simultaneously. Bahrain's capital Manama was hit. Kuwait International Airport was targeted. Abu Dhabi was struck. Riyadh and Saudi Arabia's eastern province were hit. Iran fired at the U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, at the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, at Ali Al Salam in Kuwait, and at American forces in Erbil in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. By March 5th, Iranian military sources claimed they had fired over 500 ballistic and naval missiles and nearly 2,000 drones since the operation began, with roughly 40% of those aimed at Israel and 60% targeted at American assets across the region. That is an enormous simultaneous military strike across 9 countries. And the United States had to spend close to $1.5 billion in interceptors during the 12-day war in June 2025 alone, and that was a shorter, less intense exchange. The financial and logistical strain of running air defense across that kind of geography is something that strategists have been warning about for years, but here's where the story gets complicated. Because despite the breadth of Iran's retaliation, Israel's missile defense architecture, the Arrow system that intercepts ballistic missiles in the upper atmosphere, David's Sling for medium-range threats, and Iron Dome for shorter rockets, absorbed wave after wave. By the 10th day of the 2026 war, Iranian attacks on Israel had dropped by over 90% compared to the first day. The IDF said it was because they had destroyed or suppressed the majority of Iran's missile launchers and storage facilities, including those that had been rebuilt in the months between the June 2025 ceasefire and the February 28th strikes. U.S. forces struck more than 5,000 Iranian targets in the first 10 days of Operation Epic Fury. Iran, for its part, was running low on what it could fire. None of that made the attacks that did get through any less devastating. On March 1st, an Iranian ballistic missile struck a residential neighborhood in Beit Shemesh, a city about 18 miles west of Jerusalem. It hit a communal shelter inside a synagogue, the very kind of reinforced structure that Israelis are told will save their lives when the sirens sound. 9 people were killed, dozens more were injured. 2 Israeli interceptors had been fired at that incoming missile and both missed. The Beit Shemesh strike was the single deadliest attack on Israeli civilians since the war began, and it demonstrated something that no amount of military triumphalism could paper over. Even the best missile defense system in the world is not impenetrable. In total, by March 12th, more than 2,500 Israelis had been injured in Iranian ballistic missile attacks since February 28th. 7 American soldiers were also killed in Iranian strikes on U.S. bases across the region, making this the first conflict in decades to result in American fatalities from direct Iranian fire. A U.S. refueling aircraft crashed in western Iraq on March 13th, killing 4 of its 6 crew members. The Pentagon acknowledged 11 total U.S. military deaths in the conflict. A memorial was quietly erected in Tel Aviv's Dizengoff Square for American soldiers killed in Iran. People walking past stopped. Some left flowers. A sign read, "For the American heroes, your courage and dedication will not be forgotten." Israel's schools had been closed since February 28th. Public gatherings were canceled. The country was living in an ongoing state of emergency, running to shelters, tracking alerts on a government app that could give citizens a few minutes of warning before missiles arrived. The sound of sirens had become the ambient noise of Israeli life. And it was into this surreal wartime reality, 13 days after the most dramatic joint military operation in modern Middle Eastern history, that Netanyahu sat down for a Zoom press conference with Israeli reporters. He did not hold it in person. The security situation was too unpredictable. He talked to journalists through a screen, a detail that, in its own quiet way, said everything about what daily life in Israel looked like in the second week of March 2026. He was confident. He was combative. He was clearly attempting to shape the narrative at a moment when Israel's declared victory was still being tested by incoming fire every few hours. He opened by telling reporters that Israel is becoming stronger than ever. He claimed the strikes launched on February 28th had achieved something historic, preventing Iran from moving its nuclear and ballistic missile programs underground to bunkers so deep they would have become impossible to destroy. He said the attacks had killed top Iranian nuclear scientists, inflicted severe damage on the IRGC and the Basij, and that Iran is no longer the same Iran. He said flatly, "We eliminated Khamenei." He said it not with shock, but with the tone of someone crossing a task off a list. He was asked about Mojtaba Khamenei, the 56-year-old son of the dead supreme leader who Iran's assembly of experts had appointed as his father's successor. Netanyahu's response was dismissive in a way that was almost theatrical. He called Mojtaba a puppet of the IRGC who cannot show his face in public. He said he would not take out a life insurance policy on any of the leaders of the terror organizations, which was his way of saying, on live television, that the new supreme leader of Iran might be targeted. As he said it, Mojtaba Khamenei had not been seen or heard publicly since the war began. Iran's state media was reading out statements attributed to him, but he had not appeared on camera. There were reports that he had been wounded in an airstrike. Whether that was truth or Iranian propaganda was unclear, but the symbolism was stark. The leader of a nation of 90 million people was invisible, issuing statements through state TV while Israeli airstrikes continued. Netanyahu was then asked one of the most honest questions of the entire press conference. Are you actually confident that the Iranian people will rise up and overthrow their government, given that the entire strategic justification for this operation rested on that outcome? Netanyahu paused. And then he said something that should have been the headline everywhere. You can lead someone to water, but you cannot make him drink? He admitted in those words that he did not know. He said it would happen, but acknowledged it might not be immediate. Trump, separately, had been saying the same thing. And when asked about regime change, Trump said it will happen, but maybe not immediately. After weeks of confident proclamations about liberating the Iranian people, the two leaders were suddenly threading a needle between optimism and uncertainty. Netanyahu moved on to Hezbollah. The militant group had broken its ceasefire with Israel, an agreement that had been in place since November 2024, and resumed rocket fire on northern Israeli communities earlier in the week, launching a barrage of around 200 projectiles on the night of March 11th. Netanyahu warned Lebanon's government directly, take your fate into your own hands and disarm Hezbollah, or Israel would be forced to act. He told reporters Israel had already pushed troops deeper into Lebanese territory and was carrying out massive airstrikes in Beirut's southern suburbs. He said Hezbollah would pay a very heavy price. And then, partway through the press conference, the sirens went off. Air raid alerts sounded across central Israel. Another Iranian ballistic missile attack. The IDF confirmed the incoming launch. Reporters and staff scrambled. The press conference paused. It was the 6th Iranian ballistic missile attack on Israel since midnight. The 6th, in a single day. Think about what that image represents. The Prime Minister of Israel, running his first press conference of a war he has described as a historic victory, getting interrupted by the country he just struck delivering its answer mid-speech. There is no metaphor needed here. The situation is the metaphor. Netanyahu continued the press conference after the immediate alert passed. He did not flinch visibly, but the war had made its point for him. What makes all of this so difficult to process is that both things are true simultaneously. Israel and the United States have unquestionably inflicted massive damage on Iran. Khamenei is dead. The IDF says it destroyed significant portions of Iran's nuclear infrastructure and ballistic missile launchers. U.S. forces struck over 5,000 Iranian targets. Iran's air force is effectively gone. Its navy has been devastated. Iranian missile attacks on Israel had declined by over 90% by day 10 of the war, a drop that reflects genuine degradation of Iran's launch capabilities. In military terms, the opening phase of this operation went roughly according to plan, and yet Iran is still firing. By March 12th, they were still launching missiles, however diminished in frequency, at central Israel, at U.S. bases across the Gulf, at Jordan, at Gulf neighbors who had nothing to do with the strikes but were caught in the crossfire of Iran's regional retaliation campaign. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly a quarter of the world's oil supply transits, was threatened. Iran's new supreme leader, invisible, possibly wounded, possibly reading canned statements off a script handed to him by IRGC commanders, was still issuing defiant communiques. The regime, battered and decapitated, was still standing. And Hezbollah, which intelligence analysts had assessed before February 28th as a wild card, had now fully re-entered the conflict. The group's ideological red line, an attack on Khamenei, had been crossed on the very first day of the war. Analysts from organizations tracking the conflict had predicted exactly this, noting that Hezbollah adhered to the principle of velayat-e-faqih, the doctrine that places the supreme leader at the top of both spiritual and military command. When that man was killed, Hezbollah's calculus changed. Now, northern Israel was absorbing rocket fire again for the first time in months, and Israel's military was pressing back into Lebanese territory at the same time it was trying to sustain a massive air campaign over Iran. Meanwhile, the economic shockwaves of a war involving U.S. forces directly fighting Iran were being felt across the globe. Oil prices surged. Dubai International Airport, the busiest airport for international flights in the world, halted operations indefinitely in the early days of the conflict. Airlines from Air India to British Airways to Lufthansa suspended Middle Eastern routes. Global shipping rerouted around the region. The IAEA called for an emergency session. Russia called for an emergency session of the UN Security Council. The UN Secretary General issued statements. Countries that had no stake in the fight were suddenly calculating their exposure to a conflict that had the potential to shut down the region's oil infrastructure if Iran followed through on its threat to set the region's oil and gas on fire, if its own energy infrastructure was attacked. That threat came from an Iranian military spokesman on March 12th, the same day as Netanyahu's interrupted press conference, the same day Iran claimed its 37th wave of missiles and drones had been launched, the same day Netanyahu, speaking through a screen to avoid the security risk of a physical press conference, was telling the world that Iran is no longer the same Iran. What we are watching is a war that has already changed the Middle East in ways that cannot be undone, fought between parties who are both claiming victory while both absorbing punishing costs. Iran lost its supreme leader, its top military commanders, large portions of its nuclear infrastructure, and a significant fraction of its missile capacity. Israel has lost civilians in missile strikes. Its civilians are living in shelters, its schools are closed, and it is now fighting a two-front air war while dealing with a resurgent Hezbollah. The United States has lost soldiers in direct combat with a nation it was not formally at war with, having bypassed any congressional authorization, while spending billions of dollars in munitions and interception assets every week. The moment those sirens went off during Netanyahu's press conference told you everything you needed to know about where this conflict stands. Not the triumphant version, not the catastrophic version, the real version, which is somewhere in between and far messier than either. A prime minister declaring victory on Zoom, interrupted by the enemy, he declared victory over still firing missiles at his country. A new Iranian supreme leader who cannot appear in public issuing defiant statements through state television. A region where the airports are closed, the oil markets are shaking, and countries that asked for nothing are absorbing Iranian drone strikes for the crime of hosting American soldiers. The question that no press conference can answer, and that the sirens illustrated better than any diplomat's statement, is what comes next. Does Iran's capacity to retaliate continue to degrade until the regime collapses or sues for peace? Do the Iranian people, whom both Netanyahu and Trump have repeatedly addressed directly, actually rise and seize the moment they are being offered? Or does the regime survive, battered but intact, a wounded animal that will rebuild in the dark and nurse its grievance for another generation? Netanyahu said you can lead someone to water, but you cannot make them drink. He is right. And right now, the world is standing at the edge of that water, sirens screaming in the background, watching to see what Iran's next move looks like, and whether the next press conference gets interrupted twice. If you think this story is being underreported, or you want to follow every development in real time as this war reshapes the Middle East, hit subscribe and make sure the bell is on. This is not a situation that will resolve quietly, and we are going to be here every step of the way.